In the course of the month of July of this same year, 1810, Lucian wrote to the emperor to express his desire to retire to America. Since the Mantua interview, of which we have spoken, all attempts to bring about a reconciliation between the two brothers had failed. Napoleon, after having made a last and useless appeal to Lucian, consented to his expatriation. Lucian, however, did not succeed in reaching the United States, for an English frigate arrested him in the waters of Cagliari and conducted him as a prisoner to England, where he remained until 1814, beguiling his captivity by the cultivation of letters and by putting the finishing strokes to his poems, Charlemagne and La Cerneda. Canova, who had come to Paris in the month of November 1802 to make the first consul's bust, returned to our capital in October 1810, summoned there by the emperor, who wished to entrust him with the execution of a statue of the Empress Marie Louise. Canova represented this princess in the character of Concorde, and this statue is today at Parma. During the course of the sittings which the empress accorded to the celebrated sculptor, he spoke to the emperor to the state of distress of the St. Luke Academy in Rome, which had neither revenues nor schools, and the necessity of applying some money to indispensable repairs connected with the Florence Cathedral, as well as for the conservation and maintenance of the numerous monuments and artistic objects with which this city and its churches are filled. Canova, whose acquaintance I had made at the time of his journey in 1802, wrote to me in the first days of November 1810 to beg me to remind the emperor of the good intentions in which he had left him, and of the promises which he had received from him. Being about to return to Italy, the great artist desired strongly to hear the news of the fulfillment of the promises. On November 7th, I was in a position to answer him that the emperor had ordered that the part of the German college called La Fabbrica Vecchia should be accorded to the St. Luke Academy as a place of meeting for its schools. 2. That an income of 100,000 francs should be assigned in fee simple to this academy, of which 25,000 francs should be applied to the academy, and 75,000 francs to the preservation of ancient monuments. 3. That a sum of 300,000 francs should be placed at the disposal of the president of the Academy of Florence, to wit, 200,000 francs for digging up antiquities, and 100,000 francs for encouragements to be given to artists. 4. That funds should also be granted for necessary repairs. Canova thanked me with effusion for the good news which I had communicated to him, and left Paris highly delighted at being the bearer thereof. The arrival of Lady Bathurst at Mortlake in the month of September 1810 called attention once more to an extraordinary occurrence which still remains enveloped in mystery. The various recitals which have been made of this event all agree in the matter of detail. I will briefly relate this extraordinary adventure, which is really worth being recorded. After the Peace of Vienna in 1809, Mr. Benjamin Bathurst, who, though a very young man, was English ambassador to Vienna, suddenly disappeared on the frontier of Mecklenburg at the very moment when he was about to embark for England at a port on the Baltic. He was traveling under a fictitious name with a courier of the English cabinet. Mr. Bathurst had set down at the stagehouse at Perleberg, which is situated outside the town. When he left it, he walked towards his carriage, in which the courier was already seated, and whilst putting his hand on the handle of the carriage door, the English diplomat seemed suddenly to remember something, turned around and walked behind the wall of the house. As he did not return, they went to look for him, but could not find him, and not the slightest trace of him could be found. He never appeared again from that hour, and was never seen again until a fortnight after his disappearance. There was found near the stage house where he had dined on the wayside his trousers, in the pocket of which was the commencement of a letter to his wife. Although it had been raining hard for a fortnight, neither paper nor writing had been in the least affected. It could never be found out who had brought the trousers to where they were found. Mr. Bathurst, during his journey, had been a prey to extreme agitation. He expressed his fear of falling into the hands of enemies. He had walked on foot to the house of the governor of the town and had expressed great anxiety on this point. Then, on his return to the stage house, he had burnt his papers. All these matters gave rise to the suspicion that he was mentally affected. The English embassies and the Bathurst family caused all kinds of researches and inquiries to be made, but without any result. Even today, complete ignorance exists as to what became of this unhappy man. It was in order to make in person such inquiries as might lead her to trace her husband that Lady Bathurst came to the continent with her brother. The emperor, in a letter dated June 26, 1810, ordered the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the police to furnish her with passports and to receive her with favor. He allowed her to remain in France as long as might seem fit to her. She returned to England by way of Germany without having discovered anything concerning Mr. Bathurst's disappearance. It would be superfluous to allude to the 1,000 conjectures to which this event gave rise. I will, however, say that no suspicion whatever attached itself to the French government in this matter, and that Lord Bathurst, colonial minister, the man who persecuted Napoleon most bitterly at St. Helena, was a near relation of Mr. Benjamin Bathurst. The implacable hatred with which he persecuted the great victim of English perfidy, and the abominable outrages with which he treated him, were the way in which he requited the man who was most kind towards his own kinswoman in 1810. This was not the only occasion, moreover, in which Napoleon gave marks of favor to English subjects, in spite of the bitter war which the English government was waging upon him. A certain Mr. Palmer, in whom Mr. Canning took an interest, was sent back to England at the minister's request, and the emperor informed Mr. Canning at the same time that he was delighted to have had the opportunity of making himself agreeable to him. To finish with the Bathurst family, I will add that another bereavement was in store for Mrs. Benjamin Bathurst, her daughter, who was endowed with all the gifts of youth and beauty, perished in the Tiber at Rome in 1828. Some months after Napoleon's marriage, Monsieur de Talleyrand, tormented by a thirst for intrigue and power, thought a favorable time had come to regain favor, and in consequence made up his mind to write to the emperor to offer his services. Napoleon replied to this letter on the 29th of August with a formal refusal, written in such terms that Talleyrand gave up all hope. In a very few words, the emperor stated that his letter had given him pain, that he begged him to abstain from writing to him again on the subject, as his letters would recall to him painful memories which he desired to forget. After the exchange of the ratifications of the Treaty of March 16th, and having been present at the marriage festivities, King Louis left Paris, where he had been detained till then, on April 8th, 1810, to return to Holland. The Queen, Hortense, left for Amsterdam with the Crown Prince at the same time, but went another way. Napoleon and his brother had had a final interview, which, in appearance at least, was a friendly one. The emperor was holding in his hand a knife, very elaborately worked, representing his statue, and fitted with blades and accessories, which made it a masterpiece of the cutler's art. He handed it to King Louis, who hesitated about taking it, saying that cut friendship. "Bah," said the emperor, "that only cuts bread." The good understanding which appeared to be reestablished between the two brothers was not to be of long duration. The execution of the Treaty of March 16th brought with it fresh difficulties. The exigencies of the continental system, the reciprocal broils which envenomed its application, and finally an insult paid to the French ambassador's livery at the gates of the palace ended in a rupture. One morning, whilst at Rambouillet, the emperor heard the news of his brother's abdication and flight. No previous warning, no understanding between them being there to cover or to attenuate the bad effect which such an escapade must necessarily cause in Europe. After reading these dispatches, the perusal of which was indignation, Napoleon rose and, throwing the papers on my table, deplored what he styled his brother's ingratitude in the strongest terms. Grief and vexation drew tears to his eyes. Could I expect, he cried, such an outrage from a man to whom I acted as a father? I brought him up with the feeble resources of my pay as artillery lieutenant. I shared my bread and the mattress of my bed with him. Where does he go to? To strangers, so as to make people believe that he is no longer in safety in France or in the States, which are subjected to my influence. During King Louis's stay in Paris in the first months of the year, the emperor had threatened to pursue into Amsterdam itself all persons favoring English trade. The king had replied to this threat by giving secret orders that his capital should be defended, even by means of inundation. The emperor, becoming more and more indignant at the ever-increasing resistance which his continental system, the only means in his eyes for forcing the English to peace, met with, had pushed his custom house line up to the very gates of Amsterdam, and had even ordered that this city, the seat of English trade, should be occupied. King Louis, in his extremity, had withdrawn to Haarlem with his young eldest son, who had been brought to him by the Queen in the preceding month of April, determined to submerge Amsterdam rather than to allow it to be occupied by French troops. He notified this determination to the ministers, but the council unanimously expressed itself opposed to such extreme measures. The king having next proposed the alternative of defending or of abdicating, the ministers advised the latter step. In consequence, King Louis addressed a royal message to the legislature, announcing his renunciation of the throne of Holland in favor of his son, and sent with his message a formal deed of abdication. He left Haarlem on the same day to proceed to the waters of Toplitz in Bohemia, accompanied by 2 officers of his household, from whom he separated on arriving on the foreign soil. He went by the name of Comte de Saint-Loup, which was the name of an estate which he possessed some leagues from Paris. The emperor sent to his brother at Toplitz, Monsieur de Cazes, who had been secretary of the cabinet, and who combined the posts of secretary to the commands of the Lady Mother and of counselor to the imperial court of Paris. Monsieur de Cazes was charged to invite King Louis to leave Austrian territory and to come and inhabit a country governed by a member of the imperial family. At the same time, Napoleon wrote to Monsieur Otto, his ambassador to Vienna, who sent off a secretary of his legation to the king with the purpose of inducing him to act in accordance with the emperor's wishes. Neither pressing requests nor advice could triumph over Louis's determination, nor make him abandon his resolution not to live under the influence of a government subjected to his brother's power. He even considered his voluntary exile from France as a protestation against the annexation of Holland to the empire. Napoleon, having exhausted all means of persuasion and being touched by the bad state of his brother's health, did not insist any further, and ended by yielding to his scruples which were respect-worthy, no doubt, inasmuch as they sprang from an upright and sincere mind, but which, under the circumstances, were eminently regrettable. Louis accordingly was free to choose his own place of retirement, and decided upon the town of Graz in Styria, situated in the most southern part of Austria. Having heard of the Senatus Consultum, which assigned a jointure to Queen Hortense and her children, he forbade his wife to accept anything, bidding her content herself with the private property which still belonged to both of them, an injunction which Queen Hortense saw herself forced to disobey. The situation of Holland was such at that time that its best means of safety lay in its annexation to the empire. In the new state of things in Europe, it was impossible to leave this little state to itself. Its incorporation into a great and powerful empire at least allowed the Dutch to participate in the advantages of a more direct protection, thanks to which it was possible for the commercial prosperity of this people to be once more called into life. Sensible people accordingly, and there are perhaps more sensible people in Holland than anywhere else, desired the annexation of their country to the empire, and this annexation was pronounced. The emperor ordered the young crown prince, who had been left in Haarlem by his father, in care of Madame de Boubers, his governess, and in charge of General Brune, the grand equerry, to be brought to France. Napoleon sent Arch-Treasurer Le Brun to Amsterdam in the capacity of Governor General. There was a resemblance between the character and manners of Prince Le Brun and the tastes and habits of the Dutch, and they agreed very well indeed in consequence. Napoleon received his nephew, young Prince Napoleon, who was brought to St. Cloud and who at the time was 6 years old, in an affectionate manner. He told this child that he would be his father, and that when he became a man, he would pay his father's debt and his own. He never missed an opportunity of impressing on those whom he had created kings what he expected from them in the high rank in which he had placed them. Never forget, he said to his nephew, that in whatever position my policy and the interests of my empire may place you, your first duties are towards me. Your second duty is towards France, and all other duties, even those towards the people whom I may entrust to you, only come after these. Bernadotte's election as Crown Prince of Sweden was so important an event that it seems to me necessary to speak of it with the most circumstantial details. After the deposition of Gustavus IV, the Duke of Sudermanie, this king's uncle was called to the throne. As the Duke had no children, the Diet, on his proposal, elected Prince Christian of Schleswig-Augustenburg Crown Prince of Sweden, and he became the idol of the Swedish nation. Unfortunately, he died suddenly of a stroke of apoplexy in the month of January 1810, whilst engaged in reviewing a regiment. The people, embittered by this death, which they refused to believe was a natural death, broke into a violent revolt, in which Count Fersen, Marshal of the Court, lost his life. The death of the Duke of Augustenburg was a misfortune profoundly to be regretted. If this prince had lived, a good understanding would have been maintained between France and Sweden. He had asked the emperor for one of the princesses of his family to wife. The Swedes, feeling that they needed a soldier, cast their eyes on a French general and thought that such a choice would be agreeable to Napoleon, whose friendly disposition they were anxious to cultivate. I am taking part of my story, the exactness of which I can guarantee, because its various phases happened under my very eyes, from General Philip Sigur's work on the Russian campaign in 1812, critically examined. In 1807, at the time of the evacuation of Pomerania by the Swedes, two brothers of the name of Morner, officers in the regiment of the same name, were brought to Marshal Bernadotte, who gave them his house as their prison, and about a month later sent them back to Sweden. In June 1810, one of these officers, who had become colonel, sent in his name to Bernadotte at his house in the Rue d'Anjou in Paris, and spoke to him of the desire of the Swedes to put him in the place of their deceased crown prince. Bernadotte listened to this offer with amusement, and without attaching any real importance to it at first, determined not to speak of the matter to the emperor until the proposal should have been made in official form. Some days later, an extraordinary envoy of Sweden, Baron Vreda, came to see the marshal and, confirming what Colonel Morner had said to him, asked for a reply. That was on a Saturday. Next day, Bernadotte went to St. Cloud before Mass and communicated this news to the emperor, who said to him, I know all about it. I leave you free to accept or refuse. I will act in this matter as you choose. I had charged Alquier to propose a regency and to await events. The son of the last king might have been recalled later on, but in Sweden, they do not want to have anything more to do with this family. I would rather see you there than anybody else. I will support you with my consent. Take what steps are necessary.